The scar on Veilthorn's left flank still ached when the rain came. It had been 300 years since the burst of light from a human cannon had carved through his scales, through muscle, through the membrane between his ribs, and exited in a spray of black blood and shattered bone. 300 years since he had plummeted from the sky over the Battle of Ashenmoor, crashing through 3 layers of fortification before landing in a crater of his own making. 300 years since he had lain among the corpses of his own kind, listening to the victorious humans celebrate above him, their voices strange and sharp and utterly alien. He survived, of course. Dragons were difficult to kill. But survival and healing were different things, and the wound had never fully closed. On rainy nights like this one, when the clouds hung low over the Thornspear Mountains and the world smelled of wet stone and old pine, Veilthorn could feel every strand of torn muscle fibers as though the cannon had fired only moments ago. He shifted his massive bulk on the ledge outside his cave, tucking his forelimbs beneath his chest and folding his wings tight against his sides. The rain drummed against his scales obsidian black, each one the size of a dinner plate, and ran in thin rivers down the grooves between them. His eyes, molten amber and slitted like a cat's, tracked the distant lights of the human settlement far below in the valley. Greypeak, they called it now. It had been called Ashenmoor when his kind had ruled it. Veilthorn closed his eyes and let the rain speak for him. He did not hate humans. That was the strange thing. 3 centuries of dragons would have called him a traitor for it, would have torn the thought from his skull with their claws if they could. But 3 centuries of dragons were dead, and Veilthorn had learned something in the long silence that followed their extinction. Hatred required energy, and he had none left to spare. What he felt was something more complicated than hatred, something closer to bewilderment. They were so small. That was the thing that had haunted him for 300 years, the thing that kept him awake on nights like this when the rain pulled old memories from their shallow graves. Humans were small, fragile, breakable. Their bones were hollow like a bird's, their skin terrible as parchment, their bodies incapable of generating even a fraction of the heat that flowed through a dragon's veins. They had no natural armor, no claws worth mentioning, no venom, no fire. They could not fly. They could not see in the dark. They could not survive a winter without wrapping themselves in the skins of dead animals. By every metric that Veilthorn understood, by every measure that the world had used for millions of years to separate the strong from the weak, humans should have been nothing. They should have been prey. Instead, they had conquered a continent. Veilthorn opened his eyes and stared down at Greypeak. The lights were warm and golden, scattered across the valley like fallen stars. He could see the shapes of buildings, timber and stone, crude by dragon standards but serviceable. He could see the distant orange glow of a forge, still burning despite the late hour. He could hear, if he focused his hearing to its fullest extent, the faint sounds of life. A child laughing, a dog barking, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on metal. How, he thought for the 10,000th time, how did you do it? It was not a question of strength. Veilthorn had torn humans apart with a single swipe of his claw. He had incinerated their armies with a single breath. He had watched them burn and scream and die, and he had felt nothing but the grim satisfaction of a predator doing what predators were designed to do. And yet, somehow impossibly, they had kept coming. Wave after wave, generation after generation, each one learning from the last, adapting, innovating, changing. They had looked at a species that could fly and breathe fire and shatter mountains. And instead of running, instead of submitting, instead of accepting their place in the natural order, they had done the one thing no other prey species in the history of the world had ever done. They had refused. They had refused to be prey. They had refused to be weak. They had taken their soft hands and their hollow bones and their vulnerable naked bodies, and they had built weapons that could kill dragons. Not through magic, humans had no magic, but through something far more dangerous, through understanding, through patience. Through the terrifying, incomprehensible ability to look at a problem, fail, learn again, and keep going until the problem was solved. The cannon that had torn through Veilthorn's flank had not been the first humans had built. It had been the 47th. He had learned this later in the years after the war, when he had crept down from the mountains in the shape of a human, a trick he had learned out of desperation, and read their books in their dusty libraries. 47 iterations, 47 failures. 47 teams of humans who had watched their weapons shatter or misfire or fail to penetrate dragon scale, and had gone back to their workbenches and tried again. Dragons had never needed to do anything 47 times. Dragons were born perfect. And that, Veilthorn had come to understand with slow and terrible clarity, was why dragons were extinct. A sound interrupted his thoughts. Not the rain, not the distant settlement, something closer. Something on the mountain path that wound up from Greypeak to the higher ridges. Veilthorn's eyes narrowed. His pupils dilated, then contracted, and the amber glow of his irises intensified slightly, an involuntary response, like a cat spotting a mouse. He tilted his massive head, angling the triangular fins of his ears toward the sound. Footsteps, human, one set, unsteady, irregular. The rhythm of someone who was tired or hurt or both. and beneath the footsteps, barely audible even to dragon hearing, a sound that Veilthorn had not encountered in a very long time. Crying. He should have ignored it. That was the correct response. That was the response of a dragon who had survived the extinction of his species by staying hidden, staying silent, staying away from humans. He had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of being a ghost, a rumor, a shadow, a flicker of black wings on a moonless night that humans could dismiss as a trick of the light. He did not interact with them. He did not involve himself in their affairs. He did not care about their problems. The footsteps grew closer. The crying grew quieter as though the person was trying to suppress it, failing. Veilthorn told himself to go back inside his cave. He told himself that the rain would wash away the scent, that the human would pass by and never know they had walked within 100 yards of the last dragon on the continent. He told himself all of these things, and then he stood up, because Veilthorn had learned something else about himself in the 300 years since Ashenmoor. He was very bad at doing what he was supposed to do. He moved to the edge of the ledge and looked down. The path below was narrow, carved into the mountainside by human hands generations ago, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. In the dim light of the rain-clouded moon, Veilthorn could see a figure stumbling along it, small, even by human standards, wrapped in a cloak that was far too thin for the mountain cold. The figure's hood had fallen back, revealing a face that was pale and pinched with exhaustion, framed by dark hair that clung to its cheeks in wet strands. A woman. Young, or at least, young by the measure of a species that lived less than a century. Her left arm was cradled against her chest, held at an unnatural angle, and even from this distance, Veilthorn could see the swelling, the discoloration, the wrongness of it. She was also, he noticed, carrying something in her right hand. A bundle wrapped in cloth pressed against her chest beneath the cloak. Small, moving slightly with her labored breathing. She took 3 more steps and then her legs buckled. She went down hard on her knees, and this time the sound she made was not a suppressed cry but a gasp, raw, involuntary, the sound of a body that had reached its absolute limit. She stayed there for a moment, kneeling on the wet stone, her head bowed, rain pooling in the hollows of her collarbones. Then she lifted her head and looked up at the mountain, and Veilthorn saw something in her face that made his chest tighten in a way he did not understand. Defiance. Not directed at him, she could not see him in the darkness, directed at the mountain, at the cold, at the pain in her arm and the exhaustion in her bones and whatever force had put her on this path in the middle of a rainstorm with a broken arm and a bundle pressed to her chest. It was a small defiance, quiet and internal, the kind that did not roar or burn or shatter mountains. It was the kind that simply refused to stop. Veilthorn had seen that look before. On the battlefield at Ashenmoor, in the eyes of human soldiers who knew they were about to die and charged anyway. He had never understood it. He had burned them where they stood and moved on to the next wave, and he had not allowed himself to wonder about it, because wondering about humans was a luxury that dragons could not afford. Dragons could not afford many things anymore. The woman pushed herself back to her feet, her knees shook. Her broken arm shifted and she made a sound through clenched teeth that was almost a snarl, not of pain but of anger. She took a step, then another. Then she stopped because the path ahead had crumbled. The recent rains had loosened the stone, and a section of the trail about 6 feet wide had given way, leaving a gap that dropped into a ravine that Veilthorn knew to be several hundred feet deep. The woman stared at the gap. Her shoulders rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. The bundle against her chest shifted again, and this time Veilthorn heard a sound from it that clarified its contents. A baby, a very young one by the pitch of its cry, thin and reedy and barely audible beneath the rain. The woman looked at the gap, she looked at the baby, she looked at the gap again, and then she did something that made Veilthorn's breath catch in his throat. She backed up several paces, cradling the baby tighter against her good arm and started running. She ran toward the gap. Veilthorn understood what she intended a fraction of a second before she did it, and in that fraction of a second, something happened inside him that he would spend years trying to articulate. It was not a thought. It was not a decision. It was something older and deeper than either, something that lived in the part of his brain that had evolved millions of years before dragons had learned to think, the part that recognized certain things as simply wrong. A creature with a broken arm trying to jump a 6-foot gap over a several hundred-foot ravine while carrying a baby in a rainstorm was wrong in a way that transcended species, transcended language, transcended the ancient war between dragons and humans. It was wrong, and Veilthorn moved. He dropped from the ledge, not with a fall, with a controlled descent, his wings unfurling in the darkness, spreading wide to catch the air. The rain streamed past him in horizontal lines as he angled toward the path, and the woman never saw him coming because he was behind her and above her, and the night was black and he was a dragon and dragons were silent when they needed to be. She jumped, her good foot left the edge of the path, and for a moment she was airborne, the baby screaming against her chest, her broken arm whipping out from the momentum, and then Veilthorn's forelimb came down on the far side of the gap, his claws sinking into the stone like it was soft clay, and his body became a bridge. She landed on his forearm, stumbled, fell to her knees on the scaled surface, and Veilthorn held perfectly still while she got her bearings. For 3 seconds no one moved. The rain fell. The baby cried. The woman knelt on the forearm of a dragon, staring at the black scales beneath her with eyes that were very wide and very still. Then she looked up, and she saw Veilthorn's head less than 10 feet from her own. And she did something that no human had ever done in Veilthorn's presence in 300 years of life. She did not scream. She flinched. That was involuntary, a full-body jolt that pressed the baby tighter against her chest and made her broken arm throb visibly. But the flinch passed in an instant, and then she was just looking at him, her rain-wet face tilted up toward his massive head, her dark eyes meeting his amber ones with an expression that Veilthorn could not read because it contained too many things at once. Fear, yes, he could see that buried deep. But layered over it, like gold leaf over dark wood, was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "You're real," she said. Her voice was hoarse, cracked, barely more than a whisper. "The old people were right, you're real." Veilthorn did not respond. He could respond. He had learned the human language decades ago during his years of infiltrating their libraries, but he did not because he did not know what to say. He had not spoken to a human since the war. The woman looked down at his scales beneath her knees. She looked at the gap beneath his arm. She looked back up at his face. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, small. The kind of words that humans exchanged thousands of times a day in their settlements, for doors held open and cups of water passed across tables. But Veilthorn felt them land somewhere inside his chest, in the space where the cannon's scar still ached, and they settled there like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through something that had been still for a very long time. He moved his arm slowly, very slowly, because he was acutely aware of how easily he could crush her without meaning to, and placed her on the solid ground on the far side of the gap. She stood there, swaying slightly, and pulled back the edge of her cloak to check the baby. It was still crying, its face red and scrunched, but it was alive and apparently unharmed. "I need to get to the top," the woman said, looking up the path that continued to wind its way higher into the mountains. "There's a cave. My grandmother told me about it. She said the dragon wouldn't hurt us if we just needed shelter." Veilthorn blinked, a slow, deliberate movement of his inner eyelids, the way a dragon processed unexpected information. "Your grandmother," he thought, "knew about me. She said the dragon saved people sometimes," the woman continued, her voice gaining a fragile steadiness. "During the war, she said it would swoop down and grab soldiers who were about to fall off cliffs or shield children from burning buildings. She said the other dragons killed it for it." A low, subsonic sound resonated in Veilthorn's chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as a laugh, dry, humorless, and so infrequent that the muscles involved felt unfamiliar. "Your grandmother," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, a sound like stone grinding against stone, "was mistaken. I was not killed for mercy. I was wounded for incompetence. There is a difference in the eyes of my kind." The woman stared at him, her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You can talk," she said. "You can walk on 2 legs without falling over," Veilthorn replied. "We all have our talents." Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one there and gone like lightning behind clouds. Then her legs buckled again, more seriously this time, and she sat down hard on the wet stone path. The baby in her arms let out a particularly piercing wail, and the woman's face contorted with a combination of exhaustion and despair that Veilthorn found profoundly uncomfortable to witness. "I can't make it," she said quietly, not to him, to herself. "I can't, it's too far, my arm, I can't hold her right in the path." She stopped, her jaw tightened. That defiance flickered again, weaker now, guttering like a candle in the wind. Veilthorn looked at her, at the broken arm, swelling darker by the minute, at the baby, so small it could fit in his palm, at the path ahead winding up through the rain and the dark to a cave that she would never reach on her own. He thought about the canon, about the 47 iterations, about the humans who had looked at a problem, failed, and tried again. He thought about what it meant to refuse. "Give me the child," he said. The woman's head snapped up. "What?" "Give me the child, I will carry it. You cannot manage both the climb and the infant with that arm, and if you try you will fall and the child will die and you will likely die as well. I am not interested in harvesting souls tonight. Give me the child." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Veilthorn could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the primal war between trust and self-preservation, between the knowledge that dragons had killed her kind for centuries and the evidence of her own senses, which told her that this dragon had just saved her life and was now offering to help her again. She stood up. With her good arm, she carefully unwrapped the bundle and lifted the baby out, a tiny, red-faced thing, no bigger than Veilthorn's claw, swaddled in layers of cloth that were damp but clean. She held it out to him and her hand was shaking, and Valethorn realized with a start that the shaking was not from the cold. She was terrified. She was absolutely, fundamentally terrified, and she was handing him her baby anyway. Something cracked inside Valethorn's chest. Not the scar, something deeper. Something that had been calcified for 300 years, hard and brittle and untouched, and was now developing its first fracture line. He lowered his head and very, very carefully curled his smallest claw, the one on the inside of his right forelimb, barely 6 inches long and curved into a gentle cradle, and the woman placed the baby into it. The infant settled against the warm scale, still crying but quieter now, and Valethorn held his claw perfectly still, terrified in a way he had never been terrified before, not on any battlefield, not even when the cannon had fired, because this was a baby and it was in his claw, and if he moved wrong by even a fraction of an inch. He drew the claw back against his chest, tucking it into the hollow between his forelimb and his body, where the heat from his internal furnace was strongest. The baby's crying stopped, its red face smoothed. It made a small gurgling sound and then impossibly slept. The woman stared. A tear, whether from relief or exhaustion or something else entirely, tracked down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the rain. "Come," Valethorn said and began walking up the paths. They made an absurd procession. Valethorn moved slowly, each of his footsteps deliberate and measured, because the path was narrow and one misplaced claw could send a section of it tumbling into the ravine below. The woman followed behind him, one hand on the stone wall for balance, her broken arm tucked against her side. The rain continued to fall, but it was warmer against Valethorn's body, and he found himself unconsciously angling his wings to create a partial shelter over the woman as they climbed. He did not think about why he was doing this. Thinking about it would require examining motivations that he was not prepared to examine. He simply did it, the way he simply breathed fire and simply flew and simply existed, because it was what his body told him to do, and his body was older and wiser than his mind. They reached the cave after 40 minutes of careful climbing. It was Valethorn's cave, of course, the same one he had lived in for 3 centuries, the one with the ledge that overlooked Greypeak, the one where he kept his small collection of human books and his hoard of nothing in particular because dragons hoarded instinctively, but Valethorn had long since lost interest in gold and now mostly just hoarded interesting rocks and a single oil painting he had found in the ruins of a human manor house. He did not acknowledge any of this as he led the woman inside. He simply moved to the back of the cave, where the floor was dry and the temperature was warm, and lowered his claw to the ground. The baby, still sleeping, did not stir. The woman knelt beside the claw and gently, so gently, lifted the infant out, pressing it against her chest with her good arm. Then she sat down on the cave floor, leaned against the wall, and closed her eyes. Her breathing was ragged. Her face was the color of old ash. The broken arm hung at her side, and in the warm amber light of Valethorn's eyes, a light that dragons could produce at will, like a biological lantern, he could see that the swelling had progressed to the point where the arm was nearly twice its normal size. "That arm needs setting," he said. The woman opened her eyes. "I know. I have seen it done in the war camps. I watched your field medics work on wounded soldiers. You watched humans treat wounds. I watched everything humans did. It was how I learned to kill you more efficiently, and then later how to avoid killing you at all." He paused. "I also read their medical texts, several of them. The information is approximately 60% accurate, which is a significant improvement over the 40% accuracy of your texts on dragon biology." The woman stared at him. Then very slowly the ghost smile from before returned, and this time it stayed. "You're very strange," she said. "I am the last of my species. Strange is relative." She looked at her arm, she looked at the baby, she looked back at him. "Can you set it?" she asked. Valethorn was quiet for a long time. The rain murmured outside the cave mouth. The baby slept. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, low and deep and ancient. "Yes," he said, "but it will hurt. Everything hurts right now. That is not a reason to add to it. It's a reason not to care about adding to it." Valethorn looked at her, that defiance again, that small, quiet, unbending refusal to yield. He had spent 300 years trying to understand what it was, where it came from, how a species so physically inadequate could produce beings who simply would not stop. He had read their philosophy texts, their history books, their poetry. He had studied their art and their music and their architecture. He had observed them from a distance, year after year, decade after decade, and he had accumulated facts and theories and hypotheses, but none of them had ever quite captured the thing itself. Now, sitting in his cave with a wounded human and a sleeping infant, he thought he might be closer to understanding it than ever before. Not because the woman was remarkable, by human standards she was unremarkable. Small, underfed, poorly dressed, with no visible skills or abilities or advantages. By every metric that Valethorn understood, she was the weakest kind of human. The kind that should have been first to fall, first to die, first to be culled by the relentless logic of a world that rewarded strength and punished weakness. But she had climbed a mountain in a rainstorm with a broken arm and a newborn baby, and when she had reached a gap she could not cross, she had run at it. And when a dragon had appeared in front of her, a dragon, the apex predator of the known world, the creature that had hunted her species for millennia, she had handed it her child. That was not strength as Veilthorn understood it. That was something else entirely. Something that did not fit into the categories he had spent his life using to organize the world. Something that made his carefully constructed understanding of power and weakness and survival look like a child's drawing, simple, clean, and completely wrong. "Give me the arm," he said. She held it out, her hand was shaking again, but her jaw was set. Veilthorn extended one claw and with a delicacy that would have astonished any living creature who understood what dragons were capable of, placed the tip against the swollen flesh. He could feel the fracture beneath the skin, a clean break in the radius, slightly displaced. Not complicated, not dangerous if treated, but painful. "I am going to realign the bone," he said. "When I do, you will scream. Do not bite your tongue, do not drop the baby. Do I need to take the baby again?" No, she shifted the infant to a more secure position against her chest, bracing it with her chin. "Do it." He did it fast, the only mercy he could offer. One precise movement of his claw tip, and the bone shifted back into alignment with a sound like a wet twig snapping. She screamed. The sound filled the cave, bouncing off the stone walls, and the baby woke and began to cry. And for a terrible moment the cave was a chorus of pain and fear and noise. Then the scream cut off as sharply as it had begun, replaced by harsh, gasping breaths, and the woman pressed her forehead against the baby's head and made a sound that was not a scream and not a cry, but something in between, the sound of someone processing pain that exists beyond the point where language works. Veilthorn tore a strip from the lining of his own wing membrane, it would heal in a few weeks, and used it to bind her arm, fashioning a makeshift sling that immobilized the fracture and kept the weight off it. His claws moved with a precision that belied their size, each not tight enough to hold but loose enough to maintain circulation. "When you reach the settlement, find a healer," he said. "The binding will hold for 2 days, but the bone needs proper splinting." The woman nodded. She was still breathing hard, her face slick with sweat despite the cold, but the color was starting to return to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said again, the same words as before, simple, small. But Veilthorn heard something in them that he had not heard the first time, not just gratitude but acknowledgement. Recognition of what he had done and what it had cost him and what it meant. He turned away from her and moved toward the cave mouth, where the rain was still falling and the night was still dark and the world was still the world. He needed space. He needed distance. He needed to not be looking at this woman and this baby for a few minutes because something was happening inside him that he did not have the framework to process, and it was making him feel like the cannon had fired again. "Why were you on the mountain?" he asked without turning around. Silence, then quietly, "My husband died 3 days ago. The mine collapsed. They said everyone inside was dead. We had no family in Greypeak. We came from the south for the work. His family disowned him when he married me. Mine disowned me when I married him. So when he died, the landlord said I had until the end of the month to pay the rent or leave. I had nothing. I couldn't pay. I couldn't stay. I didn't know where to go, but my grandmother used to tell me stories about the mountain, about the dragon who helped people, and I thought," she stopped. Her voice had cracked. "I don't know what I thought. I think I just didn't want to die in the streets where people could see." Veilthorn said nothing for a very long time. "The cave on the ridge," he said at last. "The one your grandmother told you about, it is not abandoned." "I know I'm in it." "That is not," he stopped himself, started again. "There is another cave, smaller, dry, sheltered from the wind, half a mile further up the ridge on the north face. It is not my cave, it is empty. You can stay there until the rain stops and then return to Greypeak." "And then what?" Veilthorn closed his eyes, the rain drummed against his scales, the scar on his flank throbbed. "And then," he said slowly, each word feeling like it was being pulled from somewhere deep and reluctant, "I do not know, but you will not die on this mountain. Not tonight, not of cold or a broken arm or a fall, I will not permit it." He felt the woman's eyes on his back. He felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing pressing against his scales, looking for something, deceit perhaps, or ulterior motive, or the hidden trap that every human had been taught to expect from dragons. She would not find one. That was the thing that Veilthorn was still struggling to understand about himself. There was no trap, there was no plan. There was only a woman with a broken arm and a baby and a refusal to die, and something inside him that refused to let that refusal go unanswered. "Can you show me?" she asked. He turned around. She was still sitting against the wall, the baby in her arm, her bound arm in its makeshift sling, her face exhausted and pale and streaked with tears. She looked, Veilthorn thought, like the most fragile thing in the world, like something that could be extinguished by a stiff breeze. She also looked like the strongest thing he had ever seen. I can carry you both, he said, if you are willing. Willing to be carried by a dragon. Willing to trust a dragon, there is a difference. She looked at him, that long measuring look again. Then she stood up slowly, painfully, every movement a negotiation with her body, and walked toward him. She stopped less than a foot from his forelimb, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her small body against his scales, and she looked up at his face and she said, My name is Alara. Veilthorn blinked, inner eyelids slow and deliberate. Why are you telling me this? Because you told me your cave wasn't abandoned. That means you live here. That means we're going to see each other again, and I don't want to keep calling you the dragon in my head. Something happened to Veilthorn's face. It took him a moment to identify it because the muscles involved had not been used in so long that they felt like they belonged to someone else. It was not a smile. Dragons did not smile. Their faces were not built for it, but it was the dragon equivalent. A slight softening of the lines around his eyes, a fractional lowering of the ridges above his brows, a micro-expression so subtle that no human would have caught it. Alara caught it. Your name, she asked again. Veilthorn. Veilthorn, she said it carefully, feeling the syllables in her mouth. That's a beautiful name. It means shadow of the burning mountain in the old language. It was considered auspicious. It still sounds beautiful. Veilthorn did not respond to that because he did not know how. Instead, he lowered his forelimb to the ground and curved it into a platform, creating a shallow basin between his body and his arm where Alara could sit with the baby. She climbed in clumsily, one-handed, wincing as her broken arm shifted and settled against the warm scales. The baby, sensing the heat, stopped crying and made a small, contented sound. Hold on, Veilthorn said. To what? To whatever you can. He stood up. The movement was slow and smooth, designed to minimize jostling, and he felt Alara's good arm tighten around the baby and her body press against the curve of his limb. Then he walked out of the cave and into the rain and spread his wings and launched himself into the night sky. They flew for less than a minute. The second cave was close and Veilthorn moved carefully, keeping his speed low and his wing beats smooth. The rain was cold on his face but warm on his chest, where Alara and the baby were nestled against his scales. He could feel the baby's heartbeat impossibly fast, like a hummingbird's, a rate that would have signaled distress in a dragon but was apparently normal for a human infant. He could feel Alara's breath, slow and deep, the breath of someone who had pushed past exhaustion into a state of calm that was either profound trust or complete detachment. He landed on the narrow ledge in front of the second cave, folded his wings and lowered his limb to the ground. Alara climbed out, and this time she did not stumble. She stood on the ledge, the baby in her arm, and looked out at the valley below. The lights of Greypeak glittered in the rain, distant and unreachable and utterly indifferent to her existence. The world doesn't care about us, she said quietly. Not to Veilthorn, to the valley, to the night, to whatever forces had put her on this mountain in this rain with this baby and this broken arm. It really doesn't. We're so small, we're so easy to break. A fall, a cold, a broken bone. Any of it could kill us, all of it could kill us, and the world would just keep going. Veilthorn stood beside her on the ledge. In the darkness, his amber eyes cast a warm glow that illuminated the cave mouth and the stone around it, creating a small circle of light in the vast darkness of the mountain night. Yes, he said, the world does not care about you. It never has, it never will. Alara looked up at him, and yet you do. Veilthorn went very still. Do I? He asked. You came down from your cave in the rain to help a stranger cross a gap in a path. You caught a baby in your claw like it was made of glass. You set a broken arm with more care than any human doctor I've ever seen. You tore a piece of your own wing off to make a bandage, and now you're standing on a ledge in a rainstorm making sure I have somewhere dry to sleep. She paused. If that's not caring, I don't know what is. Veilthorn opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I am the last dragon, he said finally. My species is extinct because of yours. Every dragon I ever knew is dead. Every cave, every nest, every territory we held for 1,000,000 years is gone, replaced by your farms and your towns and your roads. I have spent 300 years in this mountain watching your kind rebuild on the ashes of mine, and I have told myself every day that I do not care, that I am above it. That the strong endure and the weak perish, and that is the natural order of things. He stopped, the rain fell, the baby slept. But you are the weakest creature I have ever encountered, he continued, his voice very quiet, and you climbed a mountain to save a child that the world does not want. And I do not understand you, and it is driving me mad. Alara looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out with her good hand, her small, soft, nailless, clawless, utterly inadequate hand, and placed it flat against the scales of his forelimb. Her palm was warm. He could feel her pulse through it, that hummingbird heartbeat, faster than his own by a factor of 5. You don't have to understand us, she said. You just have to decide what you want to do about us. She turned and walked into the cave. Veilthorn stood on the ledge and watched her go. The cave was dry and warm, heated by a geothermal vent that he had known about for years, and within moments he could hear her settling in, arranging the baby, making soft, shushing sounds that humans made to comfort their young. He stood there for an hour. The rain slowed, then stopped. The clouds began to break apart, revealing patches of star-scattered sky between them. The moon emerged, not full, but bright enough to paint the mountainside in silver and shadow. Down in the valley, the lights of Greypeak twinkled. Veilthorn thought about the cannon, about the 47 iterations, about the soldiers at Ashenmoor who had charged knowing they would die, about the woman who had jumped a gap she could not cross, about the baby sleeping in a cave that a dragon had shown her, warm and safe because a creature that should have been her enemy had decided, for reasons it could not articulate, to help. He thought about strength, about what it meant, about the categories he had used his whole life, strong and weak, predator and prey, dragon and human, and how they had never once included a category for a woman with a broken arm who refused to stop walking. He thought about Alara's hand on his scales, warm, small, unafraid. Veilthorn spread his wings and launched himself into the clearing sky. He flew over the mountains, over the forests, over the rivers that glittered like liquid silver in the moonlight. He flew higher than he had flown in years, high enough that the air thinned and the cold bit at his wings and the stars were close enough to touch. And up there in the silence and the cold and the vast emptiness of the night sky, Veilthorn, last of the dragons, shadow of the burning mountain, survivor of Ashenmoor, made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not come with thunder or lightning or a roar that shook the heavens. It came quietly, like all the most important decisions do, as a simple shift in the shape of his thoughts, a small realignment of something fundamental, like the bone in Alara's arm sliding back into place. He was going to go back down that mountain. He was going to go back to that cave. And when Alara woke in the morning and came out to find food or shelter or a way back to Greypeak, she was going to find a dragon waiting for her. Not because he understood humans. Not because he had forgiven them for the war, or for the cannon, or for the extinction of his kind. Not because he had suddenly become soft or weak or sentimental. Because a creature that could climb a mountain in a rainstorm with a broken arm and a newborn baby was not weak. Because Veilthorn had been wrong about what strength meant for 300 years. Because the last dragon on the continent owed it to himself, and to the memory of every dragon who had ever lived and died believing that might made right, to learn what humans had always known. That strength was not about what you could break, it was about what you would carry. Veilthorn folded his wings and dove back toward the mountain, a black shape against the silver sky, silent and swift and absolutely certain for the first time in 300 years. When dawn came, Alara walked out of the cave and found the dragon coiled on the ledge outside, his massive body curved into a wall between her and the drop, his head resting on his forelimbs, his amber eyes open and watchful. At his feet, arranged with a precision that seemed almost compulsive, was a small pile of wild berries, several strips of dried meat from a cache Veilthorn had maintained in his own cave, and a bundle of clean, dry cloth that he had, apparently, torn from the remains of an old banner he had been hoarding for reasons he could no longer remember. Alara looked at the food, she looked at the cloth, she looked at the dragon. "You stayed," she said. Veilthorn lifted his head. The morning light caught his scales and turned them from black to a deep, iridescent gray, like the sky before a storm. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He considered the question. He considered it with the full weight of his 3 centuries of life, his knowledge of war and death and survival, his understanding of physics and biology and the cold mathematics of evolution. He considered every answer he could give, the practical ones, the philosophical ones, the ones that would maintain his dignity and his distance and his carefully constructed armor of detachment. Then he discarded all of them because Alara had already seen through the armor, and there was no point in pretending it was still intact. "Because you needed me too," he said. Alara held his gaze for a moment. Then she sat down on the ledge, crossed her legs, and began to eat the berries with her good hand, one by one. The baby was awake now, making small sounds against her chest, and the morning sun was warm, and the mountains stretched out below them in shades of green and gray and gold. "Veilthorn," she said around a mouthful of berries. "What?" "When I get back to Greypeak, I'm going to need a place to stay, and work, and someone to look after Myra while I find both of those things." "Myra's? My daughters?" Veilthorn looked at the baby, at the tiny, red-faced, impossibly fragile creature who had slept in his claw as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I am a dragon," he said. "I cannot live in a human settlement." "I know. I cannot work in a human mine or a human farm or a human forge." "I know. I am large and terrifying, and most of your kind would attempt to kill me on sight." "I know. I am also, he continued, and his voice dropped to a low rumble that vibrated in the stone beneath them, apparently going to Greypeak with you, because I am clearly incapable of doing anything else. Alara finished the last berry. She wiped her hand on the clean cloth. She picked up Myra, who had begun to fuss, and settled the baby against her shoulder, patting her back with practiced ease. You know, she said, my grandmother used to say that the dragon on the mountain would only help the people who needed it most. Not the strongest, not the bravest, the ones who had nothing left, the ones who had already lost everything and were still walking. That is a romantic interpretation of predatory behavior. My grandmother was a romantic woman. Your grandmother was also, apparently, the only human who understood anything at all. Alara looked at him, that look again, the one that contained too many things to name. Then she stood up, adjusted Myra on her shoulder, and looked out at the valley below. It's a long walk, she said. Veilthorn stood up beside her. His shadow fell across the ledge, across the cave, across the mountain path that wound down toward Greypeak. He spread his wings not to fly, but to shield Alara and Myra from the morning wind that was beginning to pick up. I know, he said, but you will not walk it alone. And they didn't. The last dragon on the continent descended the mountain that morning, walking beside the weakest human he had ever met. And if the people of Greypeak looked up and saw a shape on the ridge, black wings spread against the dawn, amber eyes glowing in the early light, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that spoke not of hunting but of guarding, they did not run. They did not scream. They watched and they wondered, and some of them, the old ones, the ones who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told, smiled. Because there were stories after all. Old stories, stories about a dragon on the mountain who helped people. Stories about a shadow in the sky that appeared when things were at their worst, when hope was gone, when the gap ahead was too wide and the fall below was too far. Stories about a creature that should have been a monster but chose, for reasons no one could explain, to be something else. The stories were true. And they were just beginning.